Thanks, Mick, for agreeing to do this. We've got colleagues from across the Relate Federation here, and I think they've been immersed in outcome measurement, and some of them might be suffering from outcome measurement fatigue, but I think that's something that John Mellor Clark doesn't seem to be suffer from. He appears to be immune from it. So it just for the benefit of people, I'm sure most people are familiar with you, particularly with the books that you've written, but if you can just introduce yourself and give a little bit of background for the benefit of the audience.
Yeah, I'm a professor of counselling at the University of Strathclyde. Work as a counselling psychologist with a range of different clients, mainly on a one-to-one, mainly young adults. Kind of trained as a person-centred humanistic therapist, so I tend to come from a very humanistic relational background in terms of kind of prioritising good, strong collaborative relationship with clients. And a lot of my work's been around things like relational depth and deepening, how we go about deepening relationship and the kind of levels of trust and kind of work in depth in the therapeutic relationship.
Excellent. I mean, you've mentioned one of your books, and you've written a number of books on relational depth. These events are designed to look at measuring outcomes across our service areas, and you focus very much on engagement with clients at a very deep level. So I want to ask you, how can you be an advocate of something which, on the surface at least, seems so impersonal because it's outcome measurement?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's one of the kind of myths of outcome measurement, that it's about something very technical, something which is all about statistics and numbers. And actually, I think if it's done well, it is about deepening the relationship. It's about finding ways of understanding where clients are at. Outcome forms can be, what we know from the research is that a lot of clients say that using outcome forms is a way of articulating and expressing how they feel about things that maybe they hadn't thought about before. So, you know, if you're using that at the beginning of a session for a client to say, you know, actually I really feel like there's no one there who's listening to me, then that can be a very powerful way of helping the therapist to understand what's going on for the client. And it's also about getting a sense of whether the therapy is really working for a client. A lot about a kind of depth encounter is really trying to see things from a client's perspective. And as therapists, just like everybody else, it's very easy to kind of struggle at times to really understand how clients see what's going on in therapy. And we know from the research again that as therapists we often get it wrong. You know, research shows that therapists' ratings of their own empathy are often very unconnected to what clients say. When you ask therapists what's been the most significant moment in therapy, it's often different from what clients say significant moment. So there's lots of things that we don't understand, and using outcome rating forms is a way of really trying to capture and understand more about the client experience of therapy. Because I think one of the key things is, you know, it's really difficult sometimes for clients to say to us what's going on for them. I mean, one of the things I found using forms is that, you know, sometimes things will happen in therapy that I think is fine, and and a client might mention it. One time I thought it'd be useful to write down some things that the client was talking about for her to come back to. And actually for that client, she didn't say anything in the session, but when she completed some forms at the end of the session, what she was indicating was that actually she hadn't understood why I was doing it, and she'd experienced it as a bit strange, and it had been quite kind of confusing for her. And I just wouldn't have known if we hadn't used some kind of form, because you know, it's scary to say to somebody, particularly a therapist often, you know, I'm not sure if this is helpful, or, you know, where are we going, or I'm actually feeling worse. So outcome forms are a way of kind of bringing in more material that often isn't immediately apparent.
That's really interesting, and you mentioned about the perception of the therapist in terms of the difference the counselling's making compared to perhaps the perception of the client. I mean, could you elaborate on that in terms of how can we reassure therapists that it actually benefits and it actually improves the counselling process, the journey?
Yeah, well, what we know from the research is that most clients find outcome monitoring helpful. That things like core forms, I mean, we know from the research that a lot of therapists are incredibly sceptical, incredibly wary, you know, worry that it will get in the way of therapy. Certainly when I started using outcome forms, I felt, I want to have a relationship with someone, I want to get in there, I don't want to start filling forms. But actually what we know from the research again and again is that clients like filling in those forms. Not every client. I mean, it would be true to say, there's some clients who don't like it, and I think there's some clients where, it shouldn't be used, because I've had clients, a few who said, actually, that's really not helpful for me. But in the main, what the research shows is the majority of clients enjoy filling in the forms. It helps them kind of get into the space for therapy and to think about what's going on for them. And as I was saying before, kind of maybe brings up stuff that they hadn't really thought about. So, research clearly shows that for therapy, it's a positive thing. For clients, it's a positive thing. What we also know from the outcome research, and this is a whole new area that's been coming out recently, is that when regular feedback monitoring is used in therapy, outcomes seem to be better. And that's been done now in a number of studies, very, very carefully controlled studies, mainly in the States, some in the UK. Is there some in the UK? I think there's some developing in the UK, but mainly in the States. And it's really showing that when you monitor the outcomes of therapy, and when that data is then used in the sessions and it's talked about, and that's something we might want to come back to about how you actually use the data, but when it's talked about and it's used to kind of inform and structure the therapy, that the outcomes are better. And actually that kind of feedback process, kind of using that feedback, seems to be one of the most powerful ways that therapists can actually improve the outcomes of clients. The kind of effects you get on that are actually bigger than changing between different therapies or lots of other things that we might think about are important. But regular monitoring outcome really does seem to make a difference, and it's had a massive. When I go to psychotherapy research conferences now, so often people are talking about this. Because it really seems to be making a difference.
How can we help clinicians start using feedback-informed practice and feedback-informed therapy? I mean, you know that you're working on the iRelate project, and we've seen some early successes of how integrating routine outcome measurement has made a profound difference, and it does involve counsellors starting to look at that data before that young person starts the conversation, and it's intertwined into that therapy. But what about the therapists that are uncomfortable and they need support? How can we support them?
Well, I think one of the big things is just trying it, just giving it a go and seeing what it's like. I mean, when up in Glasgow, when we started using a lot of this outcome monitoring in schools, and we decided to use it on a weekly basis rather than at the beginning and end of therapy, because we were just losing so much data with young people dropping out. I mean, a lot of the therapists were very sceptical, weren't keen, thought it would get in the way. But I have to say, after what we said is, let's try it for a term, see what happens. And after a term, when we went back to the therapist and said, look, do you want to carry on this weekly outcome monitoring? Actually, most of them said, yeah, no, we're happy to go with it. Because I think they could see that a lot of their fears about what it would do to the therapy just didn't pan out. And mostly they felt that it was quite a helpful way of kind of structuring and getting a sense of what's going on in the session. So I think the most important thing is just try it out. Just try it, just use it for a bit, see what happens, give it a go. And I think once you've given it a go and kind of got used to it, and then I know for myself now, I find it very strange, I think, doing sessions without doing some kind of outcome monitoring, just because I feel like I really wouldn't know where my clients are at. So I think that's one thing about kind of giving it a go. Kind of find out about some of the evidence about it. I mean, I think, as I said before, I think therapists' concerns are often that clients don't like doing it. But find out about that, because actually I think that's more an assumption than what the evidence shows. As I was saying, is that actually clients do like doing it. Talk to other therapists who are using it, and have used it, and find out what their experiences are. I think another really important bit about it is not just what therapists often do, and certainly what I did when I started using it, was just to kind of give it to a client or get clients to complete these forms, and then really not to do much with it. And what the research shows, and I think what comes out of clinical experience is it's something to be worked with. It's not something to be kind of given to a client and then ignored. Where it's most helpful is really where it becomes part of the therapy, where a client will fill in the measure, and then the therapist and the client will look over it. They might talk about areas where there's improvement if they've got a graph, and they can look at where things are getting better, perhaps where things are getting worse. And it becomes integrated into the session, so it's part of the, it's not that the measure is the be-all and end-all. A client might be showing more distress on the core, for instance, but actually they're happy with how the therapy is working and they're feeling pretty good about things, but maybe, they've just had a bad week or something.
Yes.
But using it as a kind of springboard to talk about what's happening makes a lot more sense to clients, I think, because they understand why they're doing it. And it brings in some important data. So I think that's another thing for, encouraging people to try it out, but also use it in a way where it becomes part of the therapy rather than something very separate from it.
Thanks, Mick, for that. In terms of what you've just covered, you seem an advocate of session-by-session measurement. Here in Relate, we are doing work on that. We do have a system for adult couple counselling, which is pre and post, but why are you such an advocate of session-by-session measurement? What are the arguments for it?
I mean, it just has to be. I mean, everybody is moving in that direction these days, and if you look at like IAPS and the results that the Improving Access Psychological Therapy program that they're collecting the data, it's all session-by-session monitoring. There's a very simple reason for it. Basically, we know from research that about 50% of clients drop out of therapy. And if you just do it at the beginning and the end, then with a large majority of clients, you are going to miss the final measure. And if you've only got data from clients who had a final session, then what we know from the research is it tends to overestimate how helpful the therapy has been overall, because what you're missing is the data from the clients who dropped out, who tend to do some, not always, but on average, maybe do a bit worse. And so it doesn't really, if you've got 50%, 30%, 20% return rates, then it just doesn't give an accurate presentation of really what's going on. So if you do it session by session, it means if a client drops out, which inevitably they're going to do for a variety of different reasons, not just because they don't like the therapy, it might be because they feel that they've got what they want, but clients do drop out, we know that. And if you do it session by session, then you've always got a last data point for each client. So, that pragmatically, that's one of the main reasons. But I think in terms of the actual work, again, just session by session, if we start with the client's value and find it useful to the outcome monitoring, then it's a way of introducing the work, starting the session, inviting the client to think about what's been going on. So I think clinically as well, there's a lot of good arguments for doing session by session monitoring rather than just at the beginning and the end.
In terms of developments in this area, you mentioned the States. I mean, could you sort of give us an insight in terms of how far the UK is in terms of research around these areas compared to the States, and who's leading the game in this area? Who's progressing? Where's the good practice where we can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, there's some great. It does tend to be in the States. There's some really good work by there's somebody called Sammy Timoney, who works in Lincolnshire in the UK, who's really been leading the development with Diane Tetley of kind of more outcome and feedback informed work with children and young people in the UK. And in the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, they've been doing a lot of work on this. And of course, John Miller-Clark at CORE has been for many, many years a leading advocate of outcome monitoring, and has really kind of pushed it with colleagues like Chris Evans, Michael Barker. Internationally, some of the leading people are, Mike Lambert in the States was the guy who really kicked it all off, and he's been enormously influential. Scott Miller, if you ever get a chance to see Scott Miller, he's an absolutely fantastic presenter, and you can also look at his website, I'm not quite sure the name, but if you Google Scott Miller, you'll find a lot of information. And also a guy called Barry Duncan, who works with Jacqueline Sparks, and they developed something called the Partners for Change Outcome Monitoring System, which is one of the most popular systems that are used, again based in the States. And I mean, what's interesting if you look at their work is that these people are all actually people like Lambert, Miller, Duncan, Sammy Timoney. I mean, everybody who's involved in this is coming from a relational standpoint. This is not advocates of a very kind of technological approach to therapy who are saying that, we need very kind of hard methods and everything needs to be rigorous. These are very relationally orientated practitioners, often who generally argue that the therapeutic relationship is the most important aspect of therapy, and are very focused on the importance and the value of the therapeutic relationship. Also tend to come from a very kind of client empowerment based agenda. It's not about, it tends to be about really wanting to promote the client voice in therapy. And it's useful. I mean, if you look at like the site of Barry Duncan or Scott Miller, you really see so much arguments for a kind of what they call a client direct client-centered or a client-led approach to therapy, which is very much integrated with the idea of outcome monitoring, and sits with some of the work that I've been doing with John McLeod on what we call a pluralistic approach to therapy, which is again very much about trying to tailor the particular practice to the particular client, and using tools like outcome monitoring, process monitoring, looking at the quality of their lives as a way of trying to tailor the therapy. So certainly for me, in kind of moving into this field and going back to your first question, I guess, Anjab, it's about tailoring and personalising therapy. It's not about turning into some kind of technical kind of machinery, which I think is often what people's fears about it are.
A question which is a bit wider, Mick, this is really useful, is about, you mentioned about how we use the data. Now we have people in the room that are from a trustee perspective, from a centre manager perspective, not necessarily from a clinical perspective. I mean, do you have any views or insight into how we can use that data positively to not only help the experience for the client individually, but help to develop services as we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you'll find in the data, I mean, generally, what we find in data looking at client outcomes is that generally they're very positive. It's very rare that you find that that the data indicates that clients, on average, are getting worse. So I guess one of the first answers to that question is that the more that there is outcome monitoring, provided, going back to the point we were talking about before, providing it's kind of a really good 100% coverage. If you've got data which is 30%, 20%, 50%, it just doesn't have any power at all. But if you've got data where you've got a good data set, you've got a really full data set, then it's great for service managers, it's great for people at that level to be able to promote and to show how much change is really happening with the client. So I think that's one of the things about it. And then I think the second is if you're using data management software and systems where you can really look at where clients are changing more, you can look at maybe perhaps the issues where you seem to be getting more change, you can be looking at whether more sessions are leading to more change. There's a whole range of different what we call moderators which you can be looking at to see what seems to be making the therapy most effective. And I think by looking at that, there's a real opportunity to improve the outcomes of the work. Again, I think it's one of the members of, core outcomes and core outcomes. That's not the only thing. I do believe that you can get very good outcomes which aren't necessarily reflected in core. But it is one way of trying to develop and improve the work that we do, and they're fantastic tools, really.
Just adding on in between the layer, I suppose, of the person, the counsellor delivering and being involved in the therapy and the managers and trustees. There's also, is there a role for supervisors to be able to use this data as part of the dialogue to support counsellors to look at different strategies and techniques with dealing with certain presenting issues? Have you got any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, David, I think that's a great point, Anjam. I mean, this data, and increasingly people are doing it now, is that they're taking the kind of the graphs of core scores, or if you're using an alliance measure, looking at the client's rating of the alliance and talking that through in supervision. And that's a great support. That's a great way of informing what's talked about in supervision, looking at what might be going on, getting a different perspective on it. I mean, if you're working with a client, for instance, where their core scores are getting worse, then that does seem like a very important thing to take to supervision. It can be threatening as a therapist because, does it mean I'm not doing a good job? Does it mean that I'm doing something wrong? I don't think that's the way to look at it. I think what's important is that, you've got a client who seems to be struggling, they seem to be struggling more and more, and that's something that needs to be, there's almost, I think, you could say, an ethical responsibility to look at that. It may turn out that life circumstances have got worse for this client. It may turn out that, it's nothing to do with the therapy at all, but I think, that needs some discussion if that's happening. And equally, of course, if a client is getting better and their core scores seem to be improving, then that's something also to take supervision and to look at and to perhaps talk about and explore. Maybe the therapist has got a lot of concerns about a client, but actually at the same time they seem to be better, and putting those two things together and talking about what might be going on there, I think would be very useful. So supervisors, I think it's important for supervisors to know how to use these tools, how to work with these tools. And again, organisations like Core IMS, I think are doing a lot of work, and it's a great site to be able to look at, to think about, how you might use these measures like the Core to really enhance what goes on in supervision and ultimately the well-being of clients.
That's brilliant, Mick. I mean, just to add on to that, I think organisations such as CORE are also doing valuable work in benchmarking organisations and looking at trends. I mean, have you had an opportunity to look at some of this data and look at the work where one organisation will submit their outcome measurement data and allow organisations such as CORE to analyse it and then obviously compare and contrast it with similar organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did some work with John and Michael Barkham and people at CORE a few years back where we compared, it was a paper that was led by Bill Stars, and we used some of this core data to look at the comparative effectiveness of CBT, person-centered therapy and psychodynamic therapy. And because the therapists have been collecting the data, we could do that. What we found was that actually these therapies seemed to be about as equally effective as each other. And it was good evidence to make a powerful argument that actually people who were working in more relational ways, person-centered psychodynamic ways, were actually as effective and bringing about as much change as therapists who work in CBT ways. But I mean, that data was entirely dependent on people, the therapists, being able to collect that data. And I think one of the concerns is that, you know, people who are working in perhaps more relational ways, dynamic, person-centered, humanistic, as well as those working in CBT ways, if therapists from those backgrounds don't collect data, then the evidence base for those approaches just isn't going to grow, it's not going to develop. And increasingly what we've seen in the political sphere is that you know, CBT has grown and become grown more and more, to a large extent because, you know, people in the CBT world have been willing to collect data and have done some fantastic research to show the effectiveness of their work. And I think often people in other approaches feel a kind of bit sidelined. But there is a real opportunity with tools like the CORE and with the outcome monitoring and the feedback process for those of us who come from a more relational standpoint to really show that what we do can be helpful and can be very valuable to clients. But it's not going to happen unless therapists are willing to collect that data. So I think we all kind of have a responsibility to be part of that if that's what we want to try and show.
That's a fantastic point, that, Mike. Mick, and you know, we need to reflect on that. If I ask you a question in terms of Relate as an organisation, do you have any thoughts on how Relate might be able to measure the longer term impact of counselling? Even though we've talked about session by session, pre and post, what about what happens months or years on? Do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, actually, in our own study, I mean, we've been working with, you know, Jamie with the Children and Young People's work, and Jamie Murdoch, and we've been doing a small randomised controlled trial. And one of the things we did there was simply 6 months after the end of therapy, 6 months after kind of when they started, was to ask them about how they were getting on. And I think there's a lot of possibilities. I mean, it needs to be set up carefully, and you know, you obviously need to let clients know at the beginning that you're going to be following them up. But you know, you can go back to people if it's set up properly, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line, and use these forms again to see how they're getting on, and to see whether the improvements have been maintained. I mean, generally the research shows that where people improve in therapy, those improvements do tend to be maintained, and you know, it's possible really to go back and to show that there is long-term change, and that it is making a difference to people's lives. Of course, you can also do qualitative research and interview people and talk to people about their experiences of therapy and what kind of differences it makes to them. And again, that kind of research is fantastic. Obviously, you can't do it with as many people because it's more intensive, but it's fantastic data in being able to really show what a difference therapy can make.
Excellent. My final question, it feels like a bit crime watching Nick Ross, but it's not, I don't have nightmares one, but we've just done a little bit of work, John, on future basing, so vision for Relate. If we're in 2015, at the end of 2015, what would we want our outcome measurement approach to look like? But looking at this the other way around, what do you consider would be the risk or dangers for Relate if we didn't, as an organisation, embrace and embed a culture of outcome measurement in our service areas?
I mean, I might be wrong here, but I just don't think that any service in the present time can be sustained or can compete without some kind of indication of what its effects are. maybe 20 years ago you could do that, maybe 10 years ago, maybe in some sectors still today you can do that. But if Relate, I almost find it difficult to imagine actually, you know, if in 5 years' time Relate were trying to sell its services, or whether to clients, because I think client services will become much more informed, and without any kind of evidence to say that, to show clearly that the therapy is making a difference, I think it would just become enormous. It would be seen as some kind of esoteric kind of movement that you know that would have to compete against a whole range of organisations, you know, government organisations, voluntary organisations, that would all be saying, you know, here's clear evidence that, you know, people who come to our services, that they get better. Now, if Relate was saying, well, you know, we think clients get better, or you know, based on what Carl Rogers said in 1959, or you know, what Donald Winnicott said, you know, in the 50s, that, you know, based on that, we reckon our clients are going to get better. I don't think it's going to stand up. I think it's just going to become more and more essential, really. I mean, perhaps in the private, you know, in the private sector, people will be able to continue without that evidence. But everything, I think, to me indicates that consumers are getting more informed, that they want clear evidence. If you look at the user organisations, I mean, you know, the user organisations, you know, mental health user organisations, they're the ones often who are saying, you know, we want evidence that something works. And so with an emphasis more on the user voice as well, I think, again, that's going to, you know, really require service providers to show that what they do works. And I think we have a duty to, you know, I think it's partly a political thing, but I think we have a responsibility to. I think the days where we can just say, well, as therapists and clients, we know this works, and, you know, that should be enough for everybody. I think there's a certain amount of kind of arrogance almost to that. I think, you know, if we believe, and we want people to believe, that what we do is effective and what Relate does is effective, then I think we have a responsibility and a kind of ethical duty, in a sense, to show that that is actually the case, and also to learn from it, and to, you know, be able to use that evidence, so that we're not just saying what I do is effective, full stop, but actually, you know, we monitor outcomes, we look at how it's going, and then we try and improve what we do. You know, we use that evidence to actually improve the kind of service that Relate is providing. Now, that's not just going to come from research. I think that can come from a lot of sources, but research can be an enormously valuable source in helping an organisation like Relate improve the service it provides to its clients, and ultimately their psychological well-being and their relationships.
That's fantastic, Mick, and it's really a strong message to leave on. Do you have any final thoughts or anything to say to the delegates before we sign off, and thank you for your time?
Not really. I mean, I think just, I guess I feel very, very passionate about this area, because for me it is so much about listening to the client voice, about being open, about being flexible, and about being able to work with clients to really enhance the kind of therapy we offer. And I think there's one thing that I'd like delegates to take away from, you know, just the conversation that we're having, is to think about, you know, the possibility of outcome measurement and this whole process of feedback as a very kind of relational, positive, empowering kind of process for clients, and not something about kind of them being monitored, clients being monitored, or introducing something very inhuman into the process. I think this whole process can be a really deeply humanising one. Thanks, Anjam. It's been really good to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mick Cooper. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.